Let me begin by asking you to comment on the fact that you're a third generation pharmacist. Tell us a bit about the careers of your father and grandfather in our profession.
Very happy to do that. I've bored many a person with that story, but I tell my students about my grandfather because my grandfather went to pharmacy school for 90 days. He started off in Battle Creek as an apprentice there, and he was told by his uncle that if he would finish up his apprenticeship and get his pharmacy license, that the uncle would set him up in business. My grandfather went through the 4 years of apprenticeship and the 90 days of pharmacy school and passed his board exam, and then went back to the uncle, who then responded with, what are you talking about? And that was the end of that idea. And he then started working as a employed pharmacist for several years until he could save up money, moving to Wyandotte, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, and setting up a drugstore there. And that's where my father was exposed to pharmacy during the Depression years, my father being born in 1920. And my father went to pharmacy school in Detroit at Wayne, and then went off and served in the Navy during World War II as a pharmacist mate. Came back, worked in Arizona as a pharmacist, then made his way back to Michigan, eventually opening up his own store in the small town of Bad Axe, Michigan, which is 100 miles due north of Detroit. A little nice farm town. And there, with his partner Jim Volk, he had quite a successful business. And that's how I grew up, in a sense, in the drugstore.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us then how you migrated from that background into the field of history of pharmacy.
Well, Bill, as a youth, I was very interested in history. That was my great love. And I went to parochial school, and in the little library there, in the Sacred Heart School, I read every history book I could get my hands on. That was my love as a youth. And I then, when I came time to think about college, I decided actually I wanted to go to pharmacy school just because I was worried about employment. And I knew pharmacy, I knew the work of being a community pharmacist, and I knew in a sense that the most important thing really was the idea of service, community service, and service to those who came into the store. So I was ready to do that, and so I applied to the University of Michigan, a College of Pharmacy, which was in a 0-5 program. I started right off. I walked in the first day in pharmacy school, which was very nice. I didn't have to prove myself at the college level. And during pharmacy school, every opportunity I had as an elective, I took a history course, and mainly ancient history of all things. And then after pharmacy school was finished, and I put in my experiential time, passed my board exam, 1977. I worked a year or so and decided that I wanted to go back to school, wanted to go back to university and study the history of science of all things, because my background in pharmacy school, as you know, Bill, in those days, you learned a great swath of science in biology, chemistry, especially in physics. And so I thought history of science could combine my two loves. And so I came here to the University of Wisconsin, where I eventually learned there was a history of pharmacy program, which I didn't know when I applied. And I was recruited by John Paris-Gondola and Glenn Sonnedecker to study the history of pharmacy here at the School of Pharmacy.
Greg, thinking about your scholarly work, how would you characterize the main thrust of your historical research, writing, and speaking throughout your career up to this point?
Well, Bill, what I've done over the years when people ask me, what do you do, or what's your work, I usually say, well, I'm a 19th century drugstore historian. That's what I do. And that's been my main focus and interest, is in community pharmacy practice, especially in what's sometimes called the long 19th century. That is from the right at the beginning of the 1800s up until about right after World War I, 1800 to 1920. It's a time of individual achievement. It's a time of organization. It's when we get the institutions that we know today so well in pharmacy, APHA, the schools of pharmacy, the major old schools of pharmacy, I should say. The state laws are passed. Educational requirements come into effect. All of those things happen during that time period. And quite frankly, Bill, that's the pharmacy I'm interested in, just from a day-to-day practice, the making of medicines from the gifts, in a sense, of the natural world. It's a transition period between the pharmacy of medieval Baghdad and that of the modern industrial world. And so that's the thrust. I was looking at that that time period, and also the professional development that occurred then, which was quite significant, going from a very individualistic based commercial drugstore practice up to a modern academic professional during that time period.
Well, as the Institute has matured over the years, it's gone through a number of phases or changes in structure and leadership. Could you comment on this briefly and give us your perspective, Greg, on the phase AIHP will be entering after your retirement, from your perspective?
Well, Bill, we will be going back, in a sense, to the model that existed with Erdőn. This has been the goal of this, and that is when Erdőn came in became director in 1941 of the Institute. That was basically his primary source of support, meager as it was, until he became a professor here at the University of Wisconsin in 1947. And so those two things were combined, being a professor and being the executive director of the Institute. And that was the model that continued on through Erdőn's tenure, and also then through the tenure of Glenn Sonnedecker and John Periscodola. That is, a professor here at the University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy would also be the executive director of the Institute. With John Scarborough's resignation in 1986, that model ceased to exist. Scarborough remained as a professor of the history of pharmacy, and I became the executive director of the Institute in a full-time capacity. And what's going to be happening now with the advent of the new George Erdőn chair in the history of pharmacy, Professor Lucas Rickert, is that he will become the historical director of the Institute, and in a sense reconstitute, is a way to look at it. As pharmacists, we do a lot of that. Reconstitute this old model of the historian scholar being in a sense, the supervisor of the historical programming of the Institute. And in addition, of course, we will have a new executive director of the Institute, Dennis Berkey, who will run the organizational aspects of the Institute. And so we are going to go back in a way to the old format, but in a new modern way that reflects the Institute's, we hope, growing set of programming as a pharmacy organization.
Greg, as we draw our conversation to a close here, give us a sense of your professional and personal plans after retirement as executive director.
Yes, Bill. Well, I plan to be spending time right in this room here, in the Erdőn room. As Fischela Scholar, I'm going to be here available to answer queries that come in, to do small amounts of research, to write small pieces for pharmacy and history and on our website and other AIHP publications. I'm also going to be working here at the School of Pharmacy in a very limited part-time capacity, working in our historical collections. And I hope to be, with some of these books you see behind me, taking these, reorganizing our collections here to make them more useful for visiting scholars.
Well, Greg, I know you well enough to appreciate that your interests are really quite multi-dimensional, and I know you have a couple of passions, at least a couple outside of pharmacy. Could you comment on that briefly? And are you looking forward to spending more time in some of those areas?
Yes, Bill. When the weather is nice, I plan to spend much of my time cycling, as long as my body holds out. Do that in the Madison area, which is full of beautiful bike trails and bike paths and such. I have a recumbent bicycle, so I'm one of those odd ducks, which won't surprise people out there who know me well. So that's one thing I will be doing. Also, I will be pursuing my interest in music. I play in a big band, plays jazz music. I also play in a Baroque recorder ensemble, and have a great interest in early music. That is, music that was written before 1750. And I don't think I've told you this yet, Bill, but I've already been recruited to serve on 2 boards of directors of organizations that deal with early music. And so I will be spending some of my spare time doing that work here. And one of those is the Madison Early Music Festival, which takes place in July every year. And I want to encourage everyone out there who's interested in early music to consider coming to Madison for the Madison Early Music Festival. Oh, and lastly, Bill, you mentioned that. I don't want to forget that I'll be, of course, working on the upcoming Congress for the History of Pharmacy, which will be taking place in Washington, D.C. in early September of 2019. I'll be giving a talk there, and I'll be helping out with the planning, and I'm very much looking forward to welcoming people from all over the world to come to the Capitol Hilton in downtown Washington for the Congress. So that's something else that's going to be taking some of my spare time.